Hi friends, this is Pastor Keith for Trinity Chapel, coming to you today with another edition of Walking Through Westminster as we keep looking at the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Thanks for being with me today. I hope you're having a great week. Today we come to two questions of the Shorter Catechism. We leave the third commandment behind and we move into the fourth commandment. And so the two questions today, both having to do with the fourth commandment, what it is, and then what is required in it. So let me read those for us. We'll get the answers, and then we'll talk for just a minute or two about what it all means. So first of all, question 57 of the Shorter Catechism asks, which is the fourth commandment? And it says, the fourth commandment is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it, and made it holy. And then question 58 asks, what is required in the fourth commandment? And it says, the fourth commandment requires the keeping holy to God such set times as he has appointed in his word, expressly 1 whole day in 7, to be a holy Sabbath to himself. You know, the fourth commandment, as we talked about in a recent sermon at Trinity Chapel, the fourth commandment is one of those commandments that Christians are pretty dismissive of, almost as if we assume that it's like the one commandment that gets left out in the new covenant. But it's still part of God's moral law. It is applicable to Christians today. We'll talk more in the coming weeks about exactly how that works and how it works for Christians to keep the Sabbath and to honor the fourth commandment. But first of all, the Catechism just starts with the basic, what is required of us in the fourth commandment. And explicitly what it says is that the fourth commandment requires us to set aside 1 whole day to be appointed as God's Sabbath, a holy Sabbath for God himself. So 1 day out of 7, the weekly schedule for all people of all time, is that you have 6 days of labor, like the fourth commandment said, and you have 1 day of rest and worship. Now it's interesting, the fourth commandment, as it's recorded in question 57, it's the Exodus version of the fourth commandment, which ties the fourth commandment back to the creation. So it essentially says you should work 6 days and rest the seventh day, because that's what God did when he created the world. We were created to be the image bearers of God, and one of the things that means is we were created to imitate him, to follow after his example and do things the way he does them. So the fourth commandment in Exodus points us back to the creation, and it says, look, God worked 6 days and then he rested the seventh. You also should work 6 days and rest the seventh day. But also, if you even went to the Deuteronomy edition of the fourth commandment in Deuteronomy 5, there also it doesn't tie it back to the creation, but rather it ties it to the redemption. So the fourth commandment in Deuteronomy 5 talks about, hey, work 6 days and rest the seventh, and remember that you were a slave in Egypt and that God brought you out of Egypt by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. I'm paraphrasing there a little bit, but if you look that up in Deuteronomy 5, that is the essence of what that version of that commandment teaches. So in both creation and redemption, God sets the example and he gives us the precedent to keep 1 day out of 7 holy as his Sabbath. Now, of course, Jesus tells us in the New Testament, rightly so, that the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So when God tells us to keep the fourth commandment, it's not meant to be this thing where you have this oppressive rule sort of restricting your joy. Rather, the fourth commandment is given to us to help and assist our joy. It's given to us for rest and for worship, to delight in the Lord our God and to rest from our earthly labors. And so God is wise in giving us this commandment. God could have very easily said that every day belongs to him, and ultimately, of course, we know that it does. But God, in his mercy, knowing our weakness and our frailty, he only requires us to set aside that 1 day in 7 as his Sabbath, on which we put aside our own desires and our own pursuits, and we rest from our earthly labor and delight in the Lord alone. It's a little bit like the tithe in that sense, where ultimately everything you possess is God's, and God only requires of us to give that 10% back to His service and His kingdom, and He essentially allows us to do what we please with the other 90% within His law. In the same way, all 7 days of the week belong to God, but God requires of us only one day to be set aside for His holy Sabbath, as it says in the fourth commandment. We'll get more into the coming weeks about exactly how that all plays out. The fourth commandment is one that we really don't understand in modern evangelicalism, and so we'll talk about kind of how this all plays out for Christians today. And there will be a number of questions about the fourth commandment. We'll probably spend the next 3 or 4 weeks just talking about the fourth commandment with the questions from the Catechism. But I hope that's a good start for you, and Lord willing, you can keep tuning in and joining with me as we keep studying that commandment and all of God's commandments through the Shorter Catechism. Thanks for being with me today. This is Pastor Keith. May God richly bless each one of you.